Welcome, everyone, to this ChemSec webinar about the importance of economic incentives based on a new report commissioned by ChemSec and done by eftec on how to unlock the market and about economic incentives for alternatives to hazardous chemicals. My name is Frida Höök. I'm the Deputy Director of ChemSec, and with me at this webinar, I have Thea Sletten, Associate Director of Economics for the Environment Consultancy, eftec, and my colleague Teresa Chell, who is responsible for policy work at ChemSec. And I will now start with a short introduction and then leave the floor to Thea to walk us through the work eftec has done and the report Unlock the Market. And then Teresa will continue with conclusions that ChemSec draws from this report and go through the policy recommendations ChemSec have developed based on this report. We will then at the end have a Q&A part. So we are very happy to receive your questions. So please use the Q&A section here in Zoom and write your questions here, and we'll try to reply to as many of them as possible at the end. And this webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as the slides will be sent out after this, earlier tomorrow morning. But first, a few words about ChemSec for those of you who are not very familiar with us. We are an environmental NGO focusing on chemicals. We are funded in 2002, and we are committed to the development of sustainable chemicals and the phase out of substances of very high concern. And we do this through constructive dialogues and discussions with companies using and producing chemicals, and by highlighting good examples. We put forward solutions that are not only beneficial for human health and the environment, but also good for future-proof companies. And we develop practical tools to facilitate for companies to have an ambitious chemicals management. And the aim with these tools is really to help companies prioritizing chemicals for substitution, as well as to find safer alternatives. We also work with investors, providing them with analytical tools to evaluate and reduce investments related to hazardous chemicals. Our funding comes from governments and charity funds, which enable us to keep our integrity. So the background, shortly. So this chemical strategy for sustainability presented by the EU Commission last fall was very clear on that substitution has not taken place at the expected pace under REACH, and that actions suggested within the strategy aims to change this. The strategy also clearly points out the need to exploit regulatory tools to reward the production of safe and sustainable chemicals. And it's also clear on that incentives are needed for industry to prioritize innovation for substituting substance of concern. The strategy is also clear on the need for helping frontrunners, and that frontrunners today encounter major economic barriers. And with this on the table, we were very keen on exploring more in detail how economic drivers could be used to make regulation more efficient and drive substitution more. And with this in mind, we contact eftec, Economics for the Environment Consultancy, and ask them to look more into details of this issue. And with that, I'd like to leave the floor to Thea to walk us through the report. Thea is Associate Director at Economics for the Environment at eftec and an economist by trade. She's worked in the chemicals policy for the last 10 years, for example, previously as a SEAC member. Thea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frida. Thanks. So, and thanks to all of you for joining the webinar today. I'm very happy to see that so many people are interested in this report. So I'm going to give you a presentation of the project's scope and aims, what we have done, and some key messages at the end. Next slide, please. So our objective was to understand the economic incentives as well as the disincentives for substitution that is created within various regulatory measures, and also why are these incentives important. So the main topics we covered were key principles on the REACH, economic principles and policy instruments. And we also carried out a case study linked to REACH authorization. So what we aimed for with this report was that we wanted it to be fairly short and kind of more high level, but focusing on key issues and general principles rather than digging too much into the details. And we also want to include relevant real world examples. There were a few things that we were aiming to avoid. So we didn't want to go into a discussion as to whether substitution is the best way to manage hazardous chemicals, because we think that's clear already from the Commission strategy. And we're not attempting here to kind of assess in details all existing or new potential ways of regulating chemicals. We're not passing judgment on what is the best way of regulating chemicals, but we are exploring some certain aspects of and principles within these types of measures. Next slide, please. So our starting point was some key principles of REACH. So here you can see 4 of them, where we had as a starting point substitution principle, which says that if a hazardous chemical has a suitable alternative, substitution should occur. So substitution is in itself an objective. We also looked into the polluters pay principle, which is that the polluter should bear the cost of both managing and preventing any damage from the pollution they caused. And this is quite relevant in our case because, of course, this is linked to economics incentives. So we also touch upon precautionary principle and right to know. However, this is slightly on the side in terms of the economic incentives focus. So we will not, it hasn't been covered to the same amount of detail, but they're of course equally important. Next slide, please. So since we were kind of talking about economic incentives, our starting point was to look into what we can learn from economics. So what we know is that any private actors, they tend to maximize benefits, their own benefits rather than others. And that could be a citizen that maximizes their own happiness, or it can be a company that typically maximizes their profits. However, this behavior can lead to some unintended consequences. For example, if this person really loves traveling to faraway countries and have to take a flight to get there, then of course the unintended consequences will be increased CO2 emissions. If we're talking about a company, maybe they want to increase the performance of the product they produce so that they can have a larger market. But this requires the use of a hazardous chemical. So what we then often see is that this maximizing own benefits behavior doesn't always align with what's best for society. So in these cases, interventions, we call them interventions, it might be policy related or otherwise, might be necessary to trigger that consideration of these unintended consequences. There are many ways of doing this. I will not go through a lot of them now. We will get back to that in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So why do we need economics incentives for substitution? Why is that important? Well, as Frida highlighted in the beginning, there are a lot of barriers for substitution. For example, it's challenging technically, it can be time consuming, it can be costly, sometimes even to the extent that it can be a risk to the business continuity. So, and since, as we know, companies tend to aim for maximizing their income and maybe minimizing their cost. So from a business perspective, it doesn't make sense to substitute or transition to alternative unless there's some sort of reward on the other end. Next slide, please. So what we then wanted to do by the knowledge of, okay, there might be need for some regulations, some interventions, some policy instruments have to be implemented, but also we know that you have this behavior of maximizing profit. So these economic incentives might actually play an important role as well. So what we did was that we looked at some kind of types of policy instruments that are quite common within the chemicals policy regime, and trying to kind of decipher what types of incentive mechanisms were already present within these systems. So we looked at restrictions and other bans, which includes REACH restrictions, Biocidal Products Directive, Roche, quite a few of these. And in itself, a ban is not relying on any economic incentives per se, but it doesn't really dictate substitution either. It just says you have to stop using the substance. But there might be some, in real worlds, you don't just ban a substance with nothing and no further consideration. Typically, there will be some sort of derogations, transition periods. There might even be additional conditions that are associated with it. And if you look into these, you will see that there might be some ways that some things, for example, permanent derogation might give stronger incentives for, less incentives for substitution than, say, a time-limited derogation would. The second category we looked into was exposure limit values and mandatory technology. And there you have things like the OELs, the Industry Emissions Directive, Water Framework Directive, that would all kind of use these types of policy instruments. And here you get a slightly different set of incentive mechanisms. So here you don't dictate that you have to substitute. However, there will often be costs of compliance that will give you an incentive. So for example, you may have to implement risk management measures within your operations to comply with, say, an OEL, and this will cost money and time possibly. So that this creates then an incentives that maybe substitution could be an optional solution. And similarly, you see that with the best available technology as well. The third category is the taxes, subsidies, and fees. And here their economic incentives are very clear because this is what it does. It changes the company's bottom line by introducing, it could be the fee, authorization fee. It can be investment grants. Taxes hasn't historically been used a lot for chemicals regulations, but it is definitely possible to envisage a tax on, say, the use of SVHCs. The last one is information-related measures, so which there are quite a few of. We already know the candidate list, the SVHC list, ChemSec SIN list, the new SCIP database, CLP. So quite a lot of different information-related measures. And this works in a slightly different way. It's more indirect. A lot of these effects, because it's often by providing information on, say, hazards and or adverse impacts to various market actors. You might see that customers will dictate and say, we don't want any SVHC in our products, and thereby companies need to react accordingly. There is one direct link there that is kind of more of a direct economic trigger, which is if you require the companies to disseminate the information themselves. So that could be labeling or downstream user communication, etc. So this is kind of an overview of the types of mechanisms that you can see within that will, together with the measure itself, can strengthen or weaken the incentives to substitute. And it should be highlighted that a lot of these are linked to the regulatory decision making. So what types of choices do you make in the system itself will change how the strength of the economic incentives. Next slide, please. So we had a bit more of a deep dive into REACH authorization, and the reason for that is that we had our case study that will come to shortly is within REACH authorization. So the authorization system has quite a lot of different types of incentives mechanisms. So it's an interesting case in that sense. So you have the direct cost route that you have with some of the other ones, where you have application fees, the cost of preparing the application itself, responding to regulators, or it can be cost of compliance with condition imposed. And this goes directly into the bottom line of the company. So the kind of impact of this, then how effective this is, will basically be directly linked to the size of this cost. However, what we believe is that the direct costs are not the strongest drivers within the authorization system. We think these are more indirect in nature. And we identified a few. We go a bit more in detail into that in the report, but there's basically some risks to business continuity of, say, if you wouldn't be granted an authorization, or if you're receiving a very short review period, which could lead to cease of production, customer and investor confidence, etc. And there are also other risks that are not linked to whether or not you receive the authorization, but it can be just continuing to using that SVAC, even if you have an authorization. It could give you reputational effects. Customers might want you to switch to better substances, etc. So these are things that are kind of on the stick side of, so it's more cost related. But it also has this other parts to it where there are potential business opportunities if companies choose to transition to alternatives early. And by doing that, you can gain a technology lead, potential patents, you might be capturing new customers and increasing sales. But of course, these gains will rely on the fact that no other companies will also continue to use the similar SVACs for that use. So it's kind of both the risks and the business opportunities are kind of uncertain in nature. So key here, I think, is that, again, linking this to regulatory decision making and consistent regulatory decision making that will change the company's perspective of what they think is most likely. What is it most likely that the gain from transitioning early will materialize, or is it not? So we have quite a few discussions on this in the report, but very short version is that if it's very easy to acquire an authorization, you have less incentives to substitute early. However, if it's difficult, of course, you have stronger incentives to substitute early. Next slide, please. So over to our case study. So we looked into the DCC most rate application for authorization for a few lead chromate pigments, which Sweden took to court in 2016 on the basis that alternatives existed for the uses applied for. So Sweden won, including the appeals, and the authorization was eventually annulled. The more interesting, I think, one of the interesting parts of this is that in the EU court ruling, some kind of key principles were set out. So that changed the way, at least to some extent, the way future decisions on authorizations would be made. So firstly, the burden of proof lies solely with the applicant. I think that was fairly clear to begin with as well, but kind of the more details, it was detailed more in the court ruling. And this ties well into the polluter pays principle. So a slightly more different aspects is that the ruling mentioned that uncertainty regarding availability of alternatives should result in a refusal of the application, not a shortened review period. And this diverges slightly from what had been done up until then. And also, lastly, they upheld that proportionality is irrelevant where conditions for granting an authorization have not been met. So that means that if there are alternatives, proportionality is not relevant anymore. Then you should always substitute as according to the substitution principle. So if you go to the next slide. So this, of course, the fact that there were alternatives for this, the court found that there were alternatives for these uses. And of course, this would have some implications for the alternative providers, because when DCC Mostrate got their authorization, that meant that the alternative providers, the market they were maybe relying on, would not longer materialize over that period. So we were interested in figuring out, so what actually, how much are we talking about? Are they big losses, small losses, etc.? So we looked into the application itself and used the information they had there on alternative prices, concentrations, and all of these things. And we were able to estimate the potential market size for the alternatives, which we found to be in the range of 200 million to 4.4 billion over the review period granted. So quite substantial. So of course, this would then be a loss to all of these alternative providers. What we further thought about is that, well, if this court ruling, if established kind of some new ground rules. So if these ground rules were established from the beginning, maybe there would have been some authorizations that were granted that wouldn't have been granted after all. So kind of other more potentially wrongfully granted authorizations. So of course, this is not something you can say, yes, of course, but so what we did instead is that we kind of did a thought experiment. So we found first that the DCC Mostrate authorization, based on weight, it only comprised 0.3% of the total volumes of SVHCs applied for. So we thought, okay, so if we assume that, say, 5% of the volume in total had been wrongfully granted an authorization for, and that the loss per ton would be comparable to what we found for the Mostrate application, we would look at potential loss to alternative providers in the order of magnitude of 1 to 10 billion per year. So I would say quite strong disincentives for substitution that potentially have occurred. Next slide, please. So it should be highlighted that these are not net losses to society. These are losses to the alternative providers, but then there are also gains to the authorization holder. So it's a distributional effect. And distributional effect will not, very often, if you look at very strict net benefits to society or net cost to society, you don't see those distributional effects. However, they are important. And in particular, in this case, they are some of the key incentives or disincentives for substitution. And you can further ask, so, but what if the benefits outweigh the cost, which was the case in all of these authorizations that has been granted? So do we actually need to consider these distributional effects? So it's a kind of a yes and no answer. So in the sense that if you have one regulatory decision, one authorization as standalone, and you see that the benefits outweigh the cost, then it is beneficial to society to grant that authorization. However, that might change if you look at the broader system. That is, if you look at all of the applications over an extended period of time. So there are multiple reasons for this, but one of them is, for example, the fact that you have diminishing cost of substitutions. The cost-benefit ratio is likely to reduce over time. So important is it is also to think about these types of signaling effects. So if this system in itself, these regulatory decisions, if they favor alternatives providers, it's likely that more companies will choose to attempt to substitute earlier in time. And of course, the flip side is true as well. If it's favoring users of SVHCs, then it's likely that companies will wait longer with starting the substitution process. So you can basically progressive substitution may be incentivized by ensuring that the polluter pays and the front runner is rewarded. Next slide, please. So what can we gain? So is there anything we can get out of kind of changing the way these incentives mechanisms works? Can we make other types of regulatory decisions, and what can be gained based on this? So we had a look into an excellent report that ECHA published very recently on socioeconomic impacts of REACH authorization. And the interesting part here is that we found that it's not a lot of the companies that starts substituting or starts the substitution process very early. And by very early, we would say at the candidate list stage or earlier. So only 35% of companies starts their substitution process at that stage, which means that maybe they are more confident than they should be in the sense of it's too easy to get an authorization, or it might be that they don't see any potential gains on the other end, or they don't see it there to be likely potential financial gains from substituting early. So if by changing some of these incentive, how the incentive structure works within the regulatory systems, and that doesn't necessarily need to be only authorizations. This applies across any policy instrument. You might get more companies to start their substitution process earlier. Next slide, which I think is the last one. Yes. So the key messages from us to you is that economic incentives can be quite powerful tools to accelerate the transition to alternatives. And it's important to keep in mind that regulatory decisions within the systems themselves may increase or decrease economic incentives within the policy instruments. Distributional effects are important, even though they don't always come out in the cost-benefit ratio, because they do provide this carrot and stick effect. And lastly, so we don't want companies to sit on a fence as to whether or not they should start transitioning to alternatives. We want it to be a race to the finish line. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Thea. With that, we move to Teresa.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Thea. That was a very comprehensive presentation of this whole report. I also, before I start, I want to encourage you all to reflect on what Thea said, and please note down any questions that you have in the Q&A section here on the Zoom. So, when we first read the conclusions of the report that Thea just explained to us, I'd say that we weren't really surprised, but rather reassured that there are numbers and financial theories supporting what we've been talking about for so long. So it's really, really great to have the perspective of such a well-established expert confirming that. There are mechanisms available and necessary to unlock the market for alternative producers. And only when we have this predictability, it's possible to make the investments needed. So, certain key aspects need to be in place for regulation to drive substitution, that's clear. And if we do this right, there's a massive market potential that would make the promises in the chemical strategy that Frida talked about before become a reality. we can make this happen. So at ChemSec, our purpose is to reduce the use of hazardous substances in products. And therefore, we've been deeply engaged in the REACH process and the mechanisms in this regulation that have the intention to drive substitution, and especially the so-called authorization procedure. And the example that was presented here on the lead chromates in paint is such a clear-cut example of a use that should never have been accepted. But following the processes in SEAC and other committees, we are convinced that there are many, many more examples where it's gone wrong in a similar way. And even if it's impossible to estimate the total market loss for all of this, we can show that it's there, and we need to make use of it to unlock the market for these actors, just like Tia presented to us. And of course, it's not only us thinking that these processes don't really drive substitution in an efficient and sufficient manner. It is one of the main reasons to why it's at the core of the REACH review. So REACH needs to live up not only to the original intentions, but also to the ambitions in the chemical strategy, ensuring toxic-free material cycles and phasing out substances of concern. You can switch a slide, please. So we want this report that I just presented, along with other work that we do at ChemSec, to highlight a few important aspects in the REACH review, aspects that are fundamental to achieve these overarching goals set by the Commission. So first of all, we need to apply the polluter pays principle in full. It's absolutely crucial that impacts on society, on human health and the environment, that this is paid by the ones using it. The companies that use hazardous chemicals should bear the costs, and if they don't, it will be more financially beneficial for them to continue the use, passing on the actual cost to society and sometimes even to future generations. So the second point to make is that we need to use economic incentives to drive this transition. As we see in the report, there are many different mechanisms to use, and the final choice of mechanisms to drive substitution needs further investigation. And of course, it depends on the future text and implementation of REACH, what it will look like. So one example that is brought up in the report, like Tia just presented, is to use fees. And this is something that we see in the Commission documents, where it is suggested to introduce a fee for using SVHCs. And it's great to see that the Commission is exploring this, both because how it could drive the use away from SVHCs, but also how these fees could then be used to stimulate the development of alternatives. And of course, this is all dependent on that the size of these fees are sufficiently large to deter companies from using it. The third point I'd like to make is that we need to support the ones driving the transition, the front runners. And in the chemical strategy, it's recognized that transforming industry, being the first movers, is costly, and these companies, they need support. This part of industry is necessary to pull the other ones along, and in the REACH review process, being a front runner must pay off in financial terms. And of course, there are many areas that could be supported, but one thing that we see clearly is that downstream users are in great need of more transparency when it comes to chemical contents from their suppliers, basically. And if we can incentivize this transparency, we will be able to see radical change towards the promises in the chemical strategy towards toxic-free material cycles. So my last point here is that the lack of action should never pay off. And we've seen way too many times now that the way REACH has been implemented has unfortunately meant that not moving to alternative substances has been profitable. The system can even promote the continued use of hazardous substances, like the example that Thea brought up already in the presentation. And the future regulation must ensure that these unintended perverse, as it's called, incentives are avoided. I can switch slide, please. So to conclude, I think it's really important that we recognize that the absolute majority of companies are driven by finances, by making profits. And it should not be profitable to continue using hazardous substances. And it is a responsibility of policymakers to ensure this in chemical regulation. And it hasn't really worked as it should. And whether it's due to legal texts or how it's been implemented or interpreted, that can be debated, but we need change. And whatever we call the procedures, whether it's authorization, restriction, or some other new fabulous word we come up with, it needs to achieve more. It needs to drive substitution. And not just in theory, not just for some, and not just for applications that don't really make a difference. It needs to drive substitution away from products so that we get rid of these substances of concern, just as it says in chemical strategy. And to do this, we need to play by the rules of financial theory. We need to make it profitable to be sustainable. And this report shows how important it is to properly make use of how the market reacts on economic incentives. We need to open that door and give access to the alternative providers so that they can make the chemical strategy a reality. That was all I had to say in my presentation, so I hand over to Frida. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Teresa, and thanks a lot, Thea, for the presentations. And we have some time and some questions. So if you have more questions, just put them in the Q&A box in Zoom. We have a first one to Thea. Do you have a favorite carrot, an incentive that you think is the most effective?
No, I don't have a favorite carrot. I think what we show in our report is that there's always various options depending on what your starting point is. You will always find ways of triggering different types of incentives. So we didn't try to figure out what is the absolute best way of doing it, but rather kind of setting out how these mechanisms appear and occur and how they can change within various types of measures already. So yeah, I don't think I want to choose one that's my favorite at this stage.
That's fine. So we have another one. How or where could we introduce a tool in the chemicals legislation to implement extended product responsibility schemes for hazardous substances? Teresa, would you make a try?
Yes. Well, of course, I mean, it's a very, very complex issue that I'm sure we can create a whole workshop to discuss. But what we see is that in the new suggestions for REACH review, it isn't clear that the responsibility is on the producers to provide information and to drive these processes. And I think that's really important. For instance, in the restriction processes, this also needs to be a responsibility for the producers and the users. It has to be the polluter pays principle. It has to be the onus of proof has to be on the producers and not relying so much on member states and the Commission.
Thank you. I see that someone raised his or her hand. Please write in the Q&A instead. Thanks a lot. We have another question for you, Teresa. Do you feel that SCIP database will help or hurt the desire to move to alternatives?
I'm laughing because, I mean, we've talked about SCIP so much. I think it's a fantastic achievement that ECHA has been able to create this database. It's been an enormous work, so hands down. And you've been able to also gather so much information in this database. I do think it is very beneficial in two ways. First of all, of course, because you have to keep track in a different way on the substances of very high concern in your products, which is really positive. It also supports then the downstream users to actually get information from the suppliers, even if it's not enough, something that we see. We wish it would be easier to search in the information, so it would be easier to also drive the alternative producers in this way, but I'm sure that can be fixed. Another kind of unintended effect that I'm sure that Tia can relate to is the fact that it is costly and difficult to find the information and supply the information to the database. And this, of course, is a deterrent per se. So not having to report to the SCIP database is an incentive. So yes, it is a direct driver, I'd say. Don't you agree, Tia?
Indeed.
Great. We have a question regarding the report. We will, when we send out the slides, there will be links to the report, but we can also send a direct link in the mail we send tomorrow, so you will have the report. You also find it on the ChemSec website. Great. So we have another question. How do you incentivize the chemical industry to transition from producing incumbent hazardous chemicals to safer alternatives? How important is it in this context that we exactly what a safe and sustainable chemicals? I can start, and maybe you would like to add, Teresa. I think it's very, I mean, that's why we did the report. It's really important to drive, give incentives to chemical industry to phase out the most harmful substances and have a larger market share for the alternatives. And the chemical strategy is very clear in this. And as Tia also said a few times, that we need consistent regulatory decisions. I think I heard a few times that it needs to be predictable for chemical industry. This is the way we are going now, and it's beneficial to actually put money and innovation and research into alternatives. And is it important to define what is safe and sustainable? Absolutely, but I also think we have a definition of what is an SVHC and what is not an SVHC. But that could also, of course, be strengthened. But we think we have already sort of tools to work with this, but we also think that safe and sustainable by design is important. And if you'd like to know more what ChemSec think about that, we have a lot of things on our website. Teresa, do you want to add on that?
No, I think you covered it. Thank you.
Okay, Tia, do you want to add something? There were a lot of questions in that one.
No, it's so good. Thank you. You answered it very well.
Okay, good. Glad. Let's see. We have a lot of questions. That's very nice. I'm not sure we will be able. We take one more. Isn't the best incentive always law, so that placing full EU's restrictions on toxic chemicals, but a lot of hazardous substances are still not restricted? So do we need to raise consumer awareness of cumulative and combination effects? Tia, would you like to start?
Well, I think with restriction or bans, as we mentioned a bit earlier, is that it's not actually so much incentives for, we're not so much talking about whether or not we're trying to trigger substitution. It's sort of, you're allowed to use it or you're not. So it doesn't really require that incentive structure per se, but as we know with restrictions as well, you have things like derogations and transition period, etc., that will play into how effective the end result of the restriction is. But yes, of course, you can you can always enforce things by law by just banning a toxic substance, and it will disappear from the market. So yes, for sure, highly efficient, but maybe not always feasible.
Very great. Yeah,
no, I mean, I think it's the perfect mix that we're looking for. Of course, we shouldn't allow for substances of concern in consumer product, just like the chemical strategy says. And when possible, we should be banning it, as I said, whatever you call it, if it's through authorization or restriction or something else. But sometimes there is this gray zone before you can do that, or in the meantime, or something that for some particular application would be more beneficial, then you should do that. So I think it's not an either or, and of course we know that strict legislation drives innovation, and it is a very, very strong incentive. It also gives the companies better situation to discuss with their suppliers. It simplifies the communication. So I think it's the golden mix we need.
Great. I see that our 45 minutes have passed. Teresa and Tia and myself, we can stay on for 5-10 minutes and reply to the rest of the questions, at least 5 minutes. But for those of you who need to leave, thanks a lot for joining this webinar. And if you like to get more alerts for other webinars ChemSec is hosting, make sure you sign up to our newsletter. And you will receive the presentation and the recording tomorrow. But for the ones that have a few minutes, we'll continue with a few more questions before we actually close. So we have another question. How do you think that economic incentive can be used and avoid regrettable substitution?
Can I answer that one? Well, I mean, I think the whole revision of REACH is going towards that. We're looking at not allowing substances of concern in consumer products per se, and then I think we have to look at regulating groups. We see that starting with the PFAS group, which is so clearly necessary to regulate as a group. I think this is really where we're headed, and there is no reason why you can't apply similar mechanisms to groups as you do to individual substances. So I definitely think that it's just as feasible for groups. Tia, do you want to add something?
No, I was just nodding in agreement. Yeah, there's no it's that should be absolutely fine. I don't think, like, technically it should be any more difficult to implement based on groups in this case. So, but yeah, it's the challenge of actually defining the groups. I guess it's more of a challenge than actual incentivizing structure here.
That is definitely a challenge, but also I think I want to mention something about predictability here, because I think it's really important that it's clear from policymakers that yes, we will regulate this group of substances or this particular substance, but that that companies will also know that there is a strict timeline where the other substances will follow, so that they do avoid investing in regrettable substitution. So I think there needs to be a combination of group bans, whatever you call it, together with a strict timeline and very clear message to industry on that these substances are not going to be allowed in products, and that's that.
I think we take 2 more questions before cutting, and sorry for not being able to reply to all your questions. Thanks for posting them, it's very interesting. So the next one is placing the burden of proof on the applicant the same as making the polluter pay? Can you elaborate more on the connection between these concepts?
Sorry, yeah.
No, please
well,
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So the polluter pays principle goes broader than just applications for authorization. So that goes across any type of regulation or any type of intervention that you're having. So this is a principle that can be applied, and it basically just says that whoever is causing the damage, it's paying to either prevent it or to kind of clean it up somehow. And the burden of proof part is that you will have to, there's a cost associated with this applying for an authorization, of course, and part of that requirement is that you need to fulfill certain criteria. So for example, one of the criteria you need to fulfill is that there should not be any suitable alternatives, and putting the burden of proof on the applicant, saying that you are the one that needs to prove this, of course comes with a cost. But if you would have done it on the other way around, that the government would have to prove that there's no alternatives, of course that would give some strange incentives for the companies applying for authorizations. So it's not the same, but they're interlinked. So it's a form of a polluter's pays principle. Yeah.
Teresa, would you like
I
to
have absolutely nothing to add.
Okay, last one. On economic incentives, have you calculated what an effective level would be? Since the EU has difficulties taxing, have you considered some kind of emission trading scheme as an alternative? Thea, let's start.
Well, this report, we're not looking into actually developing or recommending any sort of specific risk management measures. We're not looking into actually designing a system. Like I said, it's very short, like high level report looking at more specific aspects that should be considered when someone is designing this or revising policy measures. To be honest, I don't think you can calculate it. I think that would be very interesting to see if anyone would be able to calculate the effective tax level or how to implement an emission trading scheme for hazardous chemicals. But interesting ideas, unfortunately a bit outside the scope of our report.
Yes, but maybe a good theme for the next one. Let's see. So thank you, Tia, for joining us and for the good work that you and your colleagues at eftec have done. Thank you, Teresa, for the great presentation. And thanks all attendees for staying on with us, and hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Bye.